Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, helping homeowners trade out old windows for modern, energy-efficient windows with curb appeal. Estimates at callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Danny Wysentowski. All this week, we've been exploring the results of a year-long project by St. Louis Public Radio reporters into what happened almost exactly 1 year ago when a tornado hit the St. Louis region, destroying thousands of homes and hitting particularly hard in North St. Louis. The questions led our newsroom to many places and to many additional questions. They spoke to neighbors and strangers brought together by this tragedy, and our reporters also focused on the questions facing City Hall and the cycle of promises, frustration, and missed opportunities to help North St. Louis. Today, however, we are looking forward to another question and a hypothetical but very possible storm. What might happen if we are again suddenly faced with disaster like the one that struck St. Louis 1 year ago? Would we be ready? The answer is no. And we're going to talk about why that is. And later in the show, we're going to take your calls and hear what you are thinking about 1 year after the tornado. But first, let's listen to just some of the voices of the people impacted by that storm. They gathered last month at St. Louis Public Radio for a very special open mic to share their stories of May 16th, 2025, and what happened afterward.
I did what most of us do. I checked on my friends to make sure they were safe and taking shelter. I did not take my own advice.
The way in which the sun changed over my home, I knew that something was shifting.
By the time the winds picked up and I realized what was happening, I was standing at Grand and Lindell, and I was looking at the steeple of that church there. And to my right, it was dark green. And to my left, it was bright blue.
About 2:30, the phone's sirens went off. And it was shelter in place. Okay, typical sound, siren. I'll take a look at it, but I'm not gonna do anything different.
Instead, I stood at my front door watching the storm as it passed over my house. I saw large hail falling. I saw the wind bending trees almost to the ground. And in the middle of it, I called for my cat to come inside. But my cat was wiser than me. He ran across the yard and found shelter underneath the porch, protecting himself while I stood there, exposed to danger.
And then about 2:32, shelter in place now. I called my partner and he was out in the streets telling me, trees are falling everywhere. Shelter in place now. I love you. And it was that moment that I was like, is this what you say to someone before you die? That was a different kind of I love you.
I didn't know that it was a tornado. I did not hear anything. I didn't even know my phone was going off because the sound was so loud. I shook like a leaf for a long time. When I was able to get down the steps and just sit in the chair, I couldn't even speak to him. He had to go up to see what I couldn't tell him. Once he got up there, he comes down and says, oh, we got a skylight, a permanent skylight, thinking that it was just one part of the roof. The roof of the house came up from the very back. I have no idea where it landed.
We come through the community, just what she said, devastated. Trees and people outside looking, and the lights are out, and just pure havoc and disdain.
So I walk up the steps, and my partner walked through the door at that moment, but we're both walking in a huddle of glass. And when we looked up, all the windows on the back of our home were gone.
And so we just tried to make our way home, and when we get home, my windows is gone, my roof messed up, and I'm like, oh, Lord have mercy. So we boarded up my roof, we boarded up my windows, and then about a couple of weeks later, the tarp flies off of my roof. And back up in January, I had let my insurance go because it had got up to like $800. I don't even have a mortgage, but my insurance was $800. I'm like, I can't afford that.
Then 3 days later, rain. Rain, rain, rain. So my damage went from not just the roof, not just the bricks falling on the ground, but now I have mold. Extreme mold. I can't live in my home. I have been out for 11 months today. I still have mold. I have about 20 tarps on my roof. I'm not still knowing how I'm going to respond to this. Should I cry? Should I scream? I'm going to meetings. I go to meetings. I'm listening to people angry, screaming.
I woke up and started using my gas grill. Then I heard a neighbor say, "Miss Claire, I got some bacon." Somebody else said, "I got some hot dogs." And another person said, "I don't have anything, but I'm hungry." And just like that, something beautiful was born. For the next 2 weeks, I cooked every single day, feeding anyone who needed or wanted a meal, no questions asked. Because in that moment, we weren't just neighbors anymore, we were family.
Okay, I have a long list here. Since May 16th of houses that I've worked on, I've got 3 houses on Enright. I rebuilt several parapet walls. I did a structural relay on a bulge on the side of a house. 2 houses on Leduc, 1 house on Raymond, 1 house on Moffett, 2 houses on Minerva, a house on Cold Brilliant, a house on Lee, a house on Harris, and a house on Holly. I've been working my ass off, excuse my language.
The FEMA guy came out. He showed no empathy. He was rude. He had been with FEMA over 20 years. He didn't turn in nothing about my roof. His main question was, how did you miss some windows? How your windows messed up? Excuse my French, I almost said, what the F you mean? Why don't I have windows? It was just a tornado.
If this were a wooden city, our death toll would be significantly higher.
Most of the help that I've gotten has been from nonprofit agencies. They don't want to take me through a lot of changes. They don't want to know what size underwear I wear. All they want to know is, can we help you? Because recently, with all the going to the meetings and the promises that have not come through, I've begun to have headaches. Because it's always something, but the something is never for me. This has been so encouraging to me to people repeat what I've been going through.
And I don't care who get mad at me. I am a fan of Miss Spencer, our mayor. But where I have a gripe is, where's the money? My last words, time is up.
And those were the voices of Brendelyn King, Xavier Phillips, Tabitha Hunt, Elmer Simmerl, Yolanda Owens, Sandra Blackshear Miller, Clara Washington, and Patricia Miller. That story was produced by Meet Me host Luis Antonio Perez, and you can hear more stories from people impacted by the tornado by checking out the latest Meet Me podcast. And those neighbors we just heard are still dealing with the reality of this single storm. But there's reason to worry about what happens when the next one hits. There are things that St. Louis's government can do to prepare, and we'd like to invite you to join this conversation. What steps does St. Louis have to take to prepare for the next destructive storm? What questions do you have about why the city and its residents are still struggling since last year's tornado? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. And I'm now joined by St. Louis Public Radio's own Hiba Ahmad and Jessica Rogen. Hiba, Jessica, thanks for coming here.
Hey, Daddy.
So I brought up this question earlier in the show, the question of, are we ready for the next storm? And that answer seems to just be no. Hiba, why is that the conclusion that you've come to?
So I think city officials would definitely say, we are more ready for a potential storm if it were to strike, in part because they've had a year now dealing with the May 16 tornado and the recovery that's happened since then. The city has taken steps to fortify the city against its next natural disaster, the main thing being the tornado sirens, which, of course, as many people will remember, they did not sound on May 16th. Many of those have been replaced and repaired, and they are now automated. They're connected to the National Weather Service, so there is hopefully less room for human error. And they've changed the lead of that organization, which is the city's emergency management agency as well. We'll get into that in a little bit. But, they have taken some steps to really hopefully stand up a response if it were to be needed.
Mm-hmm. And I think there are various components of the city's preparedness, who they rely on, the people that those groups rely on.
Yeah.
And I think a place to start is that City Emergency Management Agency. Jessica, take us back a little bit into history. There was some issues with the leadership. There was issues with the tornado siren and a lot of scrutiny on this one agency. Remind us kind of what it's supposed to do and why things kind of blew up as the aftermath of the tornado evolved.
Sure. So when the May 16th tornado happened, we had Sarah Russell, a longtime city employee, in charge of SEMA. And Russell did not sound the tornado sirens. At the time, it was manual, and there was some confusion between them and the fire department about who was in charge. And Russell actually went out to do something totally unrelated the night that we had this big storm warning. Mm-hmm. And then in the wake of the tornado, Russell didn't follow the department's own policy about how to respond. And Mayor Kara Spencer suspended them shortly after that. So SEMA, the City Emergency Management Agency, that is what they're supposed to be doing, is responding to disasters. And they've handled other disasters or natural emergencies in the city, COVID, the 2022 floods. Yeah. And this was very sudden and took them off guard, and they did not step up at that moment.
And Hiba, I understand that SEMA, this agency, it only has 3 full-time staff currently working. They are chronically underfunded, as you describe in your reporting that's going to be coming out tomorrow. Tell us a little bit about that staffing. How much of the city are those 3 people supposed to be covering?
Yeah, so it's definitely understaffed and underfunded and has been for many, many years. And that is something that, the various commissioners, including former Commissioner Russell, has advocated for, and commissioners that came before them. And now the new commissioner, who is Greg Favor, who does have this long career in emergency management, has experience dealing with FEMA. He is also now making the case for additional funding. And right now, the Board of Aldermen is holding their budget hearings for these various city agencies. Favor requested $1.5 million for SEMA, which would bring the agency staffing up to 17 positions. He has said, he's on the record saying that, the city needs at least 11, but to reach national standards, it would be good to have 15 to 17 people for a city as big as St. Louis, right? But SEMA has been given about $830,000. And so that would, yes, bring up staffing. But, it's still not up to national standards. So maybe this is something the city is taking as a phased approach over time. But, Favor has talked about that once these staff members are in place, he's actively hiring for them now. That will finally enable the agency to start really making some progress on fortifying this department, updating their emergency operations plan, which is this kind of standard that the city is supposed to follow in case of an emergency.
Mm. Now, in our hypothetical, though, if the weather were to turn, if we were to have another abrupt tornado now, I'm curious, it's the focus of your reporting. It sounds like that staff is not yet there, and currently we'd be in a similar situation of not having enough people if a tornado were to strike. Is that what you're seeing, Jessica?
I think that's fair. I think, as Hiba mentioned earlier, are we in a better place? Probably. Favor has much more experience working with FEMA than Sarah Russell did, although Sarah Russell still had that experience. And so it might be a bit better, but we still have not built up all these various things that I know we're going to talk about that would put the city in an actually good place to respond to a natural disaster.
And on Tuesday, Greg Favor, he did tell the Board of Aldermen, he said the situation at SEMA is not something that happened overnight. We're not going to fix it overnight, but he did say that we are fixing it. And he said, though, I think really casting, a timeline on here, he said this will not be solved by the time I appear here next year, but we will be significantly better. And we are going to continue this conversation. We're going to talk about FEMA. We're going to talk more about SEMA, all of the acronyms and the people that are important here. And we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Danny Wysentowski. We're talking today about how St. Louis can prepare for the next destructive storm and what lessons we can learn from the deadly tornado that hit our city 1 year ago. I'm here with St. Louis Public Radio education reporter Hiba Ahmad and digital editor Jessica Rogen. They've both spent months as part of the reporting team that put on the series Torn, which we've been exploring on our show this week. That reporting series you can find on our website. Before the break, we were discussing SEMA. That's St. Louis's emergency management agency. And I wanted to kind of go to finish that topic a little bit up. We talked a lot about the backlash to the leadership, Sarah Russell, who has defended themselves about their leadership. But there has been a lot of firings and a lot of departures from this office. And it seems like it has created an issue of where is the expertise coming from? Where is sort of the ground level on this organization? Where do things stand right now, Hiba, as you're looking at the movement of officials in and out of this agency and the fact that they've got a plan for the next few years and maybe a bad weather situation in the near future?
So Greg Favor, he's now the commissioner of the agency. He's been in place now for just over 4 months now. And he's been really clear about the fact that, FEMA is going to take years to reform, to really build back up to where it needs to be. And look, when I spoke to Sarah Russell in an interview and to Greg Favor, they both were very clear about the fact that, people don't think about SEMA all the time because it is an agency that is tapped in cases of emergency, right? So hopefully, in theory, we're not having an EF3 tornado hit our city or our region on a weekly, monthly basis, right? So it's easy to forget about this agency. So, these commissioners have been long advocating for additional funds and have been trying to make the case that, look, like, let's not wait for the next disaster for that to be the catalyst for us to bring more money into this agency. So I think we, as a city, has now learned that lesson, unfortunately, the hard way. And there is progress being made. Of course, the budgets still need to be finalized through the Board of Aldermen, but they are poised to add more positions, which will hopefully fortify SEMA going forward. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that has really struck me in reading the reporting in Hiba, your story coming out tomorrow, is just how much of the legacy part of St. Louis City's government structure is holding things back, is setting the shape. There's the detail, I think you found, that the city is still operating under a 2003 version of an emergency operations plan. Jessica, tell me a little about what stood out to you as you've been looking at all of these things the city seemingly has not updated for a while. Were these things that the city could have acted on earlier?
Well, you can always act on something earlier. Yeah. I think Hiba make a good point that, until there is a need, sometimes it's easy to, put it in the back of your pocket. Sarah Russell did sound the alarm several times about, I don't have enough staff to respond. We aren't up to national standards. At times, the Board of Aldermen tried to get Russell and SEMA more money, but it just never happened for one reason or the other. We don't have endless money in St. Louis, unfortunately. Right. And so we're stuck with this, kind of small and outdated plan. Hopefully that will begin to change even faster now that with more sight on the agency.
And with another thought on SEMA, we actually have Ron calling from Ferguson. Ron, welcome to St. Louis on the Air. Tell us what kind of question or comment you have about St. Louis's disaster preparedness or what's happening at SEMA.
Well, one thing I would first mention that in the flood of '91, I was the Army military commander for the last 3 weeks of the flood of '93, and I remember we were talking to the Public Works Director, Robert Henry, that the city of St. Louis at that time only had $2 million in the bank, so the government picked up a lot of that. But also, we also prepared for earthquakes, and I think you're more likely to have an earthquake disaster than you are to have another tornado. And many of our buildings are not able to sustain that amount of earthquake damage if it gets above like a 5 or 6 on the Richter scale. So I think they need to be looking at that. And having 17 full-time people, to me, is a waste. They need to have people have dual roles, because there's really nothing to do for disaster prepared, 17 people to do until there is a disaster. I think they should try to put together a core of volunteers of retired engineers and contractors that will come available at the time of a natural disaster and have specific areas of responsibility.
Thank you, Ron. That's an interesting point. Hiba, I wanted to ask you about this because you've had experience with residents who have been on the ground trying to handle these issues themselves, maybe like some of the folks Ron might have worked with, people with some experience. Could SEMA be overstaffed? Could there be waste here that is thrown into this issue that doesn't actually solve things?
Not right now. I think, again,
it's not overstaffed right now. Yeah.
I think right now they have 3 full-time staff members, and I think they're clawing for as many people that they can get to I think the other thing we need to think about when we think about emergency management agencies is that they are, yes, of course, planning for natural disasters, but they are also often proactively training city officials and even leading trainings within the community on how to be prepared for major events. God forbid if there was any sort of disruption in the city, let's say the electric grid goes down or, whatever it is, they are tapped for all of that stuff. Commissioner Favor has talked about how he coordinated a lot of the calls in response to the winter weather that we experienced this past winter, right? Think about the snow and the ice that we get almost every winter here. Mm-hmm. So I do think that SEMA also plays this proactive role in preparing a city in the possibility of something bad happening, right? They also played a role in COVID, which was really interesting to learn about.
Yeah, and they also do kind of like urgent things, like say hypothetically we'd been fortunate enough to have the World Cup here.
Yes,
SEMA would have been involved in that.
Right.
Yeah, those are great points, and we do have some open lines, and if you want to join this conversation, you can give us a call now at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. Now, I want to go back to something that really stood out to me from earlier this week. The reporting teams interviewed Kara Spencer. I know both of you were involved in that interview and preparing and looking at those responses. And Kara Spencer, I think, said something almost similar to what Ron is, pointing at the federal government, but also just the sheer challenge of what faced St. Louis's emergency management team.
Our emergency management team had enormous challenges, and there was experience there. Unfortunately, it was experience that didn't pan out, and as we saw from the report I mentioned earlier, had some serious holes in it. And we've worked to bring in some new leadership to that organization, and we're looking to expand the capabilities of that. But I firmly believe, as I have been advocating at East West Gateway, that emergency management should not be siloed into cities. We need a federal government that can and should be the response to disasters this size.
And that was St. Louis City Mayor Kara Spencer speaking late last week. Jessica, what stands out to you about that? Kara Spencer, I think, defended her office and her own management in that interview. But there is this argument, and I think Ron also implied it, that the federal government was a huge missing presence, that they are responsible. But you really added a lot of reporting, and both of you. Jessica, what stands out to you about what Kara Spencer's saying about the challenges facing that emergency management team?
So the federal government has undeniably not been present like we would have liked.
Yeah.
Both in the immediate aftermath of the tornado. I think we had, an expert saying normally we would get a federal disaster declaration in one day, but it just took so much longer. And also, we haven't gotten some funding that we maybe wish we'd had. One thing that stood out for me from the clip that you just played, Danny, was Mayor Spencer saying that, like, emergency management should not be siloed into cities.
Yeah.
And Spencer has proposed, combining sort of more regional resources to make that better.
And bringing the emergency management agencies from the city and the county together. Because as we know, the storm didn't just stop at Skinkard Bolivar, right? It crosses the lines, right? So why not kind of bring all those into one umbrella when it comes to such a massive storm like this?
And without the federal government, the city did turn to some other resources. And this is the topic of consultants. This was something else that I found fascinating in the reporting that's come out. And Kara Spencer, I think, implied she also confirmed the role of consultants, although she also defended getting them involved. Talk to me, Hiba, a bit about the role of these consultants. Who are they? Are they going to be here for the time being, or are they temporary?
Yeah, so, it's not abnormal for a city who goes through a disaster of this magnitude to tap consultants. Actually, there are consultants that are literally tasked with helping cities navigate FEMA reimbursement, because it is a pretty complicated and convoluted process. And the city has brought on some of those consultants. One is Tetra Tech, for example, right? And the city is also working with McKinsey and Company, and there are a few others. And the point is here that, look, the city did not have a ton of experience dealing with this storm. Both Mayor Spencer is on the record saying that, and the city's chief recovery officer, Julian Nix, has said that as well. A storm of this nature, of this magnitude. And so they have, in many ways, reached out to these consultant agencies to help them figure out the path forward. Now, we're not exactly sure to what degree, how they're shaping that recovery and what that's going to look like going forward. But, it's both not abnormal, but it's also a bit surprising because for a city that is in Tornado Alley, that has seen tornadoes skirt the outsides of the city, that has faced flooding just as, early as 2022, we went through a pandemic, you would think that there would be a little bit more emergency management planning and experience baked into city government.
Mm-hmm. And we have Cassie, who is calling in from Dallas, but apparently who grew up in North County. Cassie, you have a question for us about our conversation about St. Louis's disaster preparedness. Share that with us.
I'm just enjoying the conversation. I feel homesick. I was just there last weekend, actually visiting. But when, about the disaster relief, I was in college, so it was late 70s, early 80s. The tornado went right down the street, right through Florissant, and it was scary. But then also, last year, my nephew is a first responder paramedic in Florissant, and it would be nice if they were a little bit better prepared. That's what I'm trying to say.
No, that absolutely. And the point you bring up, and I want to kind of we'll continue this topic, I think, after our break. But I'm curious, Jessica. A lot of people remember different disasters, the flood, fear of an earthquake, and I think there's a question of whether there's enough expertise and experience in the city's offices. I know Kara Spencer defended that. What has stood out to you when officials talk about we need more experience or we're reaching out to the right people? Are they talking about tools or what are they discussing when they talk about the experience that they're missing or that they need people to have patience for?
So, we did put out reporting on Monday that showed that, especially in the Office of Recovery, which was created after the tornado and is tasked with, making the city as whole as can be possible at this point, it got, staffed with people who don't have that experience. And one thing that stood out from Ms. Spencer is that they didn't, they really defended that and said that consultants are enough. And it does take time to hire people, but I think, one could imagine that would be a priority going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we're going to continue talking about the regional look at this and a few of the other topics. We're going to take a quick break first, but we're going to be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Danny Wysentowski. This Saturday marks 1 year since a tornado destroyed thousands of homes in St. Louis. And along with rebuilding the physical structures, the city is also trying to rebuild its ability to respond to future weather emergencies and to restore trust. Now, we want to hear from you on this topic. Do you have questions about St. Louis's preparedness for another tornado? Give us a call at 382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. And I'm joined now by two of my colleagues who've been working this past year to understand the various parts of this problem and the potential solutions. I'm here with St. Louis Public Radio's education reporter, Hiba Ahmad, and digital editor, Jessica Rogen. Hiba, so the piece you have coming out tomorrow raises a few different pieces and possible solutions that St. Louis can do to actually prepare for the next emergency. One of them is to look at something called mutual aid agreements. And this sounds like something that folks have been wishing for in the different fragmented services in our region. But what would mutual aid look like in disaster preparedness?
Yeah, so a lot of these solutions that we've put forward in the story are things that government officials have already talked about. These are ideas that they have floated. And one of the things that has been brought up are these mutual aid agreements. So think about, these are agreements that are formalized between different agencies, between, the city and the county, for example. So, for example, the city and the county fire departments have a mutual aid agreement where they say, hey, we can share staff in case of an emergency. And that's what happened on May 16th, right? County staff came in to help the city and support them. But there are some mutual aid agreements that are lacking. For example, like the street departments, right? Can we send in trash trucks or debris trucks to help kind of clear the streets and roadways quickly if we need to? And, our reporter, Kate Grumke, she had called a lot of the emergency management officials and city managers out in the county that were also hit by this storm, including Clayton. They said having these mutual aid agreements formalized and in place really helped them recover and get through those early days and weeks of the storm really, really quickly. And that's somewhere I think we really saw like the community, right? Like local volunteer groups and community members step in and start clearing that debris alongside, yes, city services, of course, and public works. But we had in the city ended up relying a lot on everyday citizens for that work.
Mm-hmm. And our listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the discussion over the duplication of different emergency services, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, the 80 other so municipalities in this region. Jessica, I'm curious, how much of this fragmentation is to blame, I guess, for the continued challenges of this region? Is there something special about disaster preparedness that's different when we're talking about, should we have a central 911, agency or something? How is this a different conversation for reporters looking into this?
In some ways, I think it's the same conversation as everything. By dividing and creating the, as you said, duplicative services, it's just there's less resources to go around if you're all doing the same thing. That said, the thing that is different is that the scale of this was just so much worse and so much bigger. And that meant that, if there wasn't a perfect response, it was just so much harder. And, people aren't perfect. And we obviously have already talked about a lot of problems that were structural that made things harder in the moment. It kind of reminds me of what, the mayor said in the clip you played about we need to unify the regional SEMA agencies. I think that's true.
Especially if the federal government is going to, formalize these changes regarding the way that it responds to disasters, right? If that does come to fruition, that states are more taking on the burden of responding and paying for these disasters, I think that's where Mayor Spencer really spoke up and said, look, then we need a little bit more coordination across our different municipalities so that we can really respond effectively and take care of our residents.
Mm-hmm. And I think we should touch just on FEMA and its role in the federal government. There's, trying to understand the direction of these federal agencies can change by the day.
Yeah.
Hiba, do we have any sense of whether FEMA will change kind of how it's looking at cities like St. Louis in these situations, or is there still confusion?
Yeah, so right now at the national level, there is a 12-person council that had come together and put together a list of recommendations to essentially reform FEMA. FEMA now also has a new person in charge of it that it has advocated for keeping FEMA and restructuring it and reforming it as opposed to abolishing it completely, which is something that, President Trump did float in his early days in office last year. And I'm not going to list off all of the various recommendations that they put forward. They haven't been taken up yet by any congressional leadership. This would take an act of Congress, of course, to lead any sort of major reform to FEMA. But one of the recommendations, for example, is to possibly raise the threshold for getting federal disaster aid. So meaning that if you increase that number, right? So remember, this disaster cost us, it was estimated to be $1.6 billion worth of damages, right? If the federal cap increases, that means, hey, maybe this storm wouldn't qualify for federal relief. One of the other suggestions that has been floated is, maybe what states can get from FEMA is just a lump sum payment up front, as opposed to, depending on the severity of the disaster, as opposed to paying it for themselves and then getting it reimbursed after the fact, which is how FEMA works right now. So cities and states would front the costs, and then they would submit a ton of paperwork and documentation in hopes of getting reimbursed from FEMA. But of course, like a city like St. Louis, can be a bit cash strapped at times. That's tough. How can a city like St. Louis be able to respond to a $1.6 billion disaster? I mean, Mayor Spencer has been very clear about the fact that we just can't.
Yeah, and part of this issue, it comes down to money, and in a weird way, it comes down to a difficulty of spending money quickly. Mm-hmm. This is personal finance, and city government have very different guidance about this. But Jessica, tell us a little bit about this, because one of the points that I think that Hiba will bring up in her reporting tomorrow is trying to move this money faster out of these grants, out of these programs, and into actually doing demolitions. What are you seeing of why it's difficult to spend money in St. Louis?
So we don't, in St. Louis, have a good way to move money quickly. And that sounds repetitive from your question, but it actually is the actual substance of it. So, for example, if you want to hire a contractor to do debris removal, it has to go through a lengthy RFP process that takes days, and you have to take a certain amount of bids. And meanwhile, people's homes are covered debris, they can't drive down streets. So we don't have a way to quickly in emergencies make that process faster.
Right. And that comes from the fact that, last summer, the Board of Aldermen did approve $30 million of RAMS funds, the interest that had accrued on the RAMS funds, right? And then questions slowly as the months kind of dragged on was okay, well, then why isn't this making its way to residents, right? And we've heard that question from residents time and time again. It's well, you guys approved this money. Why isn't it going towards our home repair program? Or in the early days, tarping, why can't I get my home tarped, So
or re-tarped, as that woman had to deal with.
Exactly. So that is definitely a structure that is, I think Board of Aldermen have been pretty clear about. They have talked about okay, well, what do we need to do in order to make this move faster? I think last year there was a measure that was introduced to maybe reform the emergency contracting processes, which would basically hopefully speed up that process, kind of get through these kind of the request for proposal process, taking multiple bids, these various structures that were created with the idea that, we're trying to protect taxpayer dollars. We want to make sure we're vetting these contractors, but I think many of us can imagine that becomes a bit cumbersome in time of emergency.
Mm-hmm. And I'll note one point about why it's important to have an actual process in place is that, as we've already talked about, FEMA reimburse work.
Yeah.
And one of the guidelines from FEMA is that cities have to follow their own process in order to qualify for reimbursement. So if we were just to go rogue and be forget all the guidelines, we're just going to do it, that work would not be, qualify for reimbursement. Right.
Mm-hmm. And the city, and the early reporting showed the city really believed that FEMA was going to do a lot more reimbursement than it actually ended up doing. And I know that was the reporting that showed how many months and how much time was lost, it appears, as the city waited to see if they could convince FEMA to make an exception. One piece that I want us to touch on, and I think that is going to be part of the reporting looking forward, of course, is a huge tranche of money from the Rams settlement. When the Rams left St. Louis as a football team, hundreds, more than $100 million. There's now a proposal that was, I think, just announced this morning that's coming to the Board of Aldermen that would put $110 million of that settlement to North City. Hiba, what's your kind of immediate reaction to this? What are you looking for?
Yeah, so originally I was interested to see what type of programs that money would be funneled towards, and it looks like the city did announce a couple of ideas. And so that's really going to be the question of like, okay, if they do move forward with approving this money towards rebuilding the north side, can they do that in an effective and quick manner that really, starts to impact residents' lives, right? People have already been waiting for a year and living in storm-damaged properties or living away from their homes, displaced throughout the region. People can only wait so long. Like we've heard that time and time again from residents. We heard at the top of the hour that, people are they don't have the resources that, everyone else may have in order to rebuild these kind of historic homes. We've gotten this question a lot recently. Well, why didn't residents have insurance? And is it fair that the city has to, help support these residents? And what we found in our reporting earlier this week in terms of the question of what did it mean to hit North City is that this is a region of the city that has struggled to obtain insurance because these are homes that are undervalued and therefore underinsured, right? And the level of damage that has just happened is significantly more than what their home is valued at, right? And so there's a lot of these various reasons that have then led to residents maybe letting their insurance lapse because it was just too expensive, or they just couldn't get it insured in the first place. So there's these different moving factors that, I think residents are waiting for the city government to really put forward a program.
I mean, it's amazing that these are issues that have affected this region for a long time, and yet this next year is, I think, still going to be pretty critical as people are right on the edge. And I want to go back to something that Kara Spencer said during her interview with Kate Grumke last week. And Kate had asked her to respond to, the slowness of the demolitions, the repairs. I think she mentioned that there had been 23 homes demolished and 23 homes perhaps demolished when thousands more need work. And Kara Spencer acknowledged that slowness and kind of gave a projection for what she's looking at in the next year.
It has been enormously slow. Our city has historically been slow at a lot of things, but we are now in a position where we've been able to shore up many of the city processes that were far too slow to begin with, and we've got the partnerships on the ground working that are ready to accelerate this work for year two, and as we go into weather that will be much more accommodating for doing that work.
And that was St. Louis City Mayor Kara Spencer speaking late last week. Jessica, when you hear the word year two, the city is now having to look at the next calendar year, and there's still a lot of questions open of how these systems are supposed to work. Can they repair more than a couple dozen homes when they have thousands need? What are you looking at in year two?
So Spencer and Julian Nix have said that, they've spent this year one building the infrastructure in the Office of Recovery. They have all these contractors lined up, and now they're really going to begin. And I think that they have kind of said that a few times, especially since 2026 started. And we are just sort of starting to see that. Earlier this week, the city announced that they were moving 120 more homes into the demolition pipeline, that they were using this state pool of money that really hadn't been tapped until now. So, it will be interesting to see if we are truly beginning to ramp up, or if we're going to see more slowness, more hesitation, and accordingly more frustration from residents living in North St. Louis.
Hiba, I want to ask you as we get toward the close of our show, you talked about when you were doing your reporting in the Academy neighborhood, and there's a particular house that you had seen that was destroyed and that you kept seeing as you continued going back to it. And it sounded like it kind of became a symbol of what the status.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what does that house look like now? What does that status symbol seem like to you as you're measuring this process? And what are you looking at for year 2?
The house is on the corner of the 5200 block of Enright in the Academy neighborhood, which is a neighborhood I've visited, dozens of times at this point over the last year, following a group of volunteers over there who are trying to rebuild. And that house, just to give people, I think a lot of people have actually driven by this house. It's a white home. It was beautiful. It was a gorgeous manicured lawn, beautiful, loved-on home, and it was blown completely open. You can still see the staircase, a tall lamp, a chair that had been flipped over, and it's kind of just stood there, frozen in time for the last year. And yesterday I was out there and there was finally a demolition sign out in front of it. So I believe that it is on the list and it's expected to come down today or maybe into this weekend. I think it's going to be kind of jarring to see if once it's gone, because it really has been this, like you said, symbol for me, as it's just been there day after day, week after week, month after month, just kind of sitting there. The resident who owned that home was never able to move back in, of course.
Wow.
And then what I'm thinking about looking forward to year 2 is that just seeing if the city really is able to get these home repair programs up and running and get these homes demolished. Some residents have told us that they would love to get started on repairs on their homes, but the house next to theirs is in really bad shape. So they're like, wait, so if I start repairs on my house, but this wall from my neighbor's house comes down and hits my house again, that's not really going to do anything for me. So, I think just really trying to see this progress block by block in North City and in the Central Corridor, maybe seeing some of those tarps finally come down. And I would love to also see like the tree canopy restored,
Yeah, when I think of the symbol of what the situation feels like to me, when I saw Fairgrounds Park and just the very eerie feeling of how many trees were knocked down and the whole space feeling different, and then seeing that debris and those trees removed and feeling like you're in a renovated apartment and you've cleared out all the furniture and you have a sense of how much space there is and what's always been there.
Yeah.
Jessica, in our last minute, when you are looking at the state of the city, is there something that symbolizes that status for you, the blue tarps or a particular house?
Ooh. I don't have as distinct a symbol as Hiba does. I've been someone who's been editing a lot of these stories and right from the first weekend of, when the tornado hit. And so I think that for me, the symbol is kind of like metaphorical, and it is the anger of people who have not gotten help. And if we see that to kind of like diminish even a little bit, that will be progress for me.
People have been being told to wait, to be patient for a long time, and there's a limit on that, it seems. Yeah. Well, Jessica Rogen, you are the digital editor for St. Louis Public Radio. Thank you so much for being here talking about this project. And Hiba Ahmad is St. Louis Public Radio's education reporter. Thank you both for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Laura Hamden, and my colleague Jessica Rogen and I are your daily hosts of the Gateway newsletter. We meet with the editors in the STLPR newsroom every weekday to bring you the top local stories of the day in a quick and easy 6-minute read by 6 a.m. In an age of overwhelm, it's a refreshing, thoughtful take on the news day, if we do say so ourselves. Fine-tune your daily news habit with the Gateway newsletter. Subscribe at stlpr.org/gateway.